Welcome to the Middle East 101 series. My name is Alessandro Arduino, and I am Principal Research Fellow here at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Today, I'm very excited to have with us my colleague, Dr. Aisha Al-Sarihi. She is an expert in clean energy policy and climate economic policy and governance, and her focus is on the Arab region. Aisha, if I recall correct, holds a PhD from Imperial College London, and she specialized in environmental science, having obtained a master's degree and a bachelor's degree with distinction at the Sultan Qaboos University in Oman. Previous to her posting here at MEI and US, she's been working as a researcher and as a visiting scholar in a very important academic institution ranging from London School of Economics, Georgetown University, the Center for Contemporary Arab Study at the Georgetown University, as I mentioned, and recently at King Abdullah Petroleum Study and Research Center from 2019 to 2021. Also, she is a visiting researcher at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington. Today, Aisha is going to tackle a very compelling argument, what to expect from the United Nations next conference on climate change, COP27. But now, please allow me, without further ado, to give the floor to Aisha. Please.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Alex, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks to everyone who is joining here in the room or online. Before I start, as Alex mentioned, today I'm going to speak about what to expect from Egypt, host of upcoming UN climate conference, the COP27. And I must say that before going into the slides, this is a very broad question, and it can be tackled from a different angle and from different perspectives. However, as Alex mentioned, my expertise is focused on the Arab region and in the Middle East. And in today's talk, I will focus mainly, and we will look at it from the perspective of the Middle East. The outline of my presentation today, I'm going to tackle 5 points. First of all, I'll give a brief background about the UN COP conferences, and then we will give a background about the MENA region, how the MENA region is impacted by climate change, and secondly, what is the current state of climate action in the MENA region. What is the current state of the policy and the governance in the MENA region. And third, I will go back to the main question, what to expect from COP27. And finally, since we are speaking from Singapore, I posed this question: why should MENA climate dynamics matter for Singapore? So I wanted to start my presentation by this picture. If you are not familiar what this is the moment when the Paris Climate Agreement has been adopted back in 2015 in Paris at COP21. It is the moment when the second climate treaty has been adopted since the establishment of the United Nations framework for the Climate Change Convention. Now it has been, since 2015, it has been 7 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And today is actually, it marks 30 years since the adoption of the UNFCCC itself. So I wanted to say that since I focus on the Arab region, the Arab region has already hosted 3 COPs before, 2 COPs in Morocco, COP7 in 2001, COP22 in 2016, and Qatar hosted also 1 COP, COP18 in 2012. As I mentioned, it has been 7 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And during those 7 years, the negotiations has focused on how the countries could, operationalize the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Now the COP in Egypt and the COP also in the UAE, they are critical. They are going to be critical meetings because now the countries will not focus on negotiating how to achieve the objectives, but now they are in a point where they need to look at how they implement what has been negotiated before. So now it is a critical moment. It's not about discussing, it's about the implementation. And the UAE next year, in the UAE, the first global stocktake will take place. Global stocktake, it's a mechanism that is used to assess the progress of the countries in achieving the ambitions, their climate ambitions, either in terms of mitigation or adaptation. And we will delve more on the current state of climate action in the Middle East itself. We will look at the gap between the ambition and the implementation, where the Middle East is standing today. Right. So here, this is the map for the MENA region. I'm not going to explain what MENA region is, but this is to give you an idea where Egypt is and where the UAE is. So if we look at Egypt, Egypt is in Africa, in North Africa. And when a country hosts a COP, it gives that country an opportunity to voice out their climate concerns and interests. And they don't do it for the country itself, but they do it also at the regional level. So a question that comes in mind is that, so this year COP has been dubbed as Africa COP. So Egypt is in a position to also represent the African climate interests. And these mainly include the water security, the food security, that all go under the adaptation, the loss and damage, as well as, and importantly, the finance of the climate change. However, Egypt itself is also part of the Arab region. So in the UN negotiations, countries, they don't go individually, but they go into groups. And then there is an Arab group, and Egypt is part of that. So Egypt also is in a position also to represent the interests of the Arab countries, including the Arab Gulf states. And as I will show in the next slide, there are differences in the economic wealth among the Arab countries. So with that, the interests will be also different. Whether the countries want to focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and tackle the issue from its roots, or they want to focus on solving the problem. So I would leave that as a question here, and we will move on, and hopefully we can answer those points as we move on. Here, I just wanted to give a brief background about the Middle East context in terms of the population. The population has almost increased 5 times since 1960, and it will continue to increase, as we see from the figure on the right. As I mentioned, the Middle East countries are including countries, some of the poorest and as well as some of the wealthiest countries. And when it comes to climate change, this is really important to consider, because the wealthiest countries could have the cushion actually to adapt and also to progress in climate change. But the poorest countries, they might not have that capacity in terms of the finance, in terms of the human capacity to address the climate change. And here comes the question of cooperation or competition between the countries when it comes to addressing the issues of the climate change. Here I wanted to highlight on the Arab Gulf state countries because the Arab Gulf states, in terms of their economy, the economy is mainly dependent on hydrocarbon resources. Almost 1/3 of the oil reserves is in the Gulf Arab states, and almost a quarter of the global natural gas reserves is in the region. And the region, these countries, 6 countries, depend heavily on the revenues that comes from the oil and gas. And I wanted to mention this because I think although the Gulf Arab states would face similar challenge to the other parts in with the rest Middle East region in terms, of water scarcity, food security, the rise in the temperature and the extreme weather events. However, also this group of countries, I will show later on, are also going to be affected differently by the climate change and how the climate negotiations are advanced and how the global climate policy advance. So now moving to the second point in today's presentation, the impacts of the climate change in the MENA region. I'm going to speak about it from 2 angles, the physical impact and the socio-economic impact. In terms of physical impact, there is now enough scientific evidence that shows that the Middle East region is one of the most vulnerable regions to the climate change, and that manifests through the rise in the temperature, the changing patterns of the rainfall in the region, which has an arid climate conditions and water resources in there are already scarce, the sea level rise and the exposure to extreme weather events. I think visualization also and maps helps to convey the message. So there are some climate models that shows that the Middle East region is warming twice faster than the rest of the world. And here we are looking at 2 different scenarios. The scenario in the top is the moderate scenario, and the one in the bottom is the worst case scenario. Moderate scenario is the assumption behind it is that the global community will take action on climate and that they will advance their climate policies. Even with that, as the color becomes brown and red, it means it's getting hotter and hotter. So even with the moderate scenario, the region is going to warm. But in a worst case scenario, where the climate policy is not going to advance as expected, you can see by the end of the century, the color over the region is turning to red. And that should be alarming for policymakers and the stakeholders in the region and also globally. Also, in terms of the rainfall patterns, it's also a climate model suggests that rainfall patterns will be variable over time. And as we look at both scenarios, as the color gets lighter, it means lower rainfall. So in general, the region will experience lower rainfall in the next few years. And this is also very challenging for the Middle East, because the Middle East, based on the World Resource Institute in this map, suggests that it is one of the most water-stressed regions in the world. It boasts only 1% of world's total renewable freshwater resources. And this map, the scale in it is very good visual how about the water scarcity globally. So again, here, if we look at the scale, the darker the color, the more water stressed the region is. And for the gray basically means it's already water scarce region. So for the Middle East, you can see it's mostly either gray or red. Again, on the same issue, here, before I give more details, I just wanted to say, although the region is one of the most water-stressed regions in the world, 90% of the people has access to fresh water in there. However, if we look at the global average when it comes to the water resource scarcity annual threshold, the world average is almost 6,000. For the Arab region, the average is 1,000. And it is even worse than that. It is actually below the absolute water scarcity threshold of 500 cubic meter per capita per year. And as I mentioned earlier, the region is experiencing a growth in the population. It is also experiences a general growth in industrial and urbanization. And with that, the demand for water will also be rising over time. Now, most of the water needs are met either through groundwater or through surface fresh water. But also the water desalination, where you take the water from the sea and then you desalinate it into fresh water, is also the demand for that is also increasing. And so also the supply in the region is increasing. And this figure that we look at shows that desalination capacity in the Middle East is around 50% of global capacity. And the International Energy Agency suggests that the water desalination in the region will increase 14-fold by 2040. And so with climate change and with the variable in the rainfall, that could bring more and more challenges for the region, especially that the desalination is an energy-intensive industry. And all countries who ratified the Paris Agreement, they are under pressure to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and also to reduce the environment footprint. So the countries are also under pressure to expand their desalination and at the same time also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that comes out of it and other environmental consequences. Also, the Middle East region is exposed to extreme weather events, including the cyclones, flash floods, the sandstorms. And I've tried here to collect pictures from recent years. And actually, there are studies that shows that the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events have been increasing over the last few years. And I'm bringing examples from the last 10 years. From 2007, the cyclone Gono in Oman, which hit Oman and it caused death there. Most recently, the country also was hit by another cyclone last year in October. And the sandstorm, it has been there already in the region, but the frequency and the intensity of it has been increasing over the last few years. Now we are moving to also discuss the economic impacts, because I think it's important for us not only talk about the physical impacts, it's important to talk about the economic impacts, because that gives signals to the stakeholders and the policymakers in there to work on reducing the economic impacts that are associated with the climate change. And there is a growing number of studies that look at how the GDP of a country will be affected if we don't tackle climate change. And again, here I'm bringing the same scenarios, climate model scenarios, the worst and the moderate scenario. So again, the one on the left is showing the worst case scenario, shows with the color is getting really dark. So there's a massive decline in the GDP. And the moderate scenario is a little bit promising in comparison, because the color is not as dark as the figure on the left. Yeah, one study is showing that if the Middle East warm by 3 degrees Celsius, it could cause a GDP loss of around 0.2 to 0.5 in a yearly basis by 2027, or it could be a 3% decline of the GDP by the mid of the century. And if you are interested, I put a source of the study below. Here I'm looking at the GCC. I mentioned that the GCC is a special case within the Middle East in the way it is going to be impacted by the climate change. I mentioned the rise in the temperature, the floods, the sandstorms, the impact on the food security, and so on. But also, given the dependence of the region on the hydrocarbon resources, this presents a challenge for the economies of those countries. And that comes from the global interest to tackle climate change. And that happens through reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And since fossil fuels account for nearly 80%, the burning of it account nearly for 80% of those greenhouse gas emissions, most of the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions will come from reducing the dependence on the hydrocarbon globally. So we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. What does that mean for oil-producing countries, the GCC or other countries in the region as well? It could translate into a future where the demand of the oil and gas could decline, because with the entry of the Paris Agreement into force, countries started to adopt climate strategies and climate neutrality targets that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And what I am showing in the table, I'm showing the trade partners with the GCC. Those trade partners, they are major consumers of oil that comes from the GCC. As you can look at the figures on the left, for example, Japan, it depends, or it imports 88% of its oil from the region. South Korea, it imports around 50. And so, but all of those countries have set targets. For example, they set net zero target to be achieved by or around mid-century. And well, perhaps at the moment, we don't see that materialize maybe in reality. However, we have seen what could advanced climate policies could do to the oil demand and the oil prices through the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also through the implications of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. shall we wait and see what the advanced climate policy will do, or should we taking precautions from now? Here, with this map, I want to make a little bit of transition from what I have been speaking about. So I spoke about the physical and the economic impacts of the climate change. But here I want to bring to your attention that climate change also has a security implication. And it could, if it not addressed properly, it could shape the security of the Middle East in the next few years. What I'm showing here in this map is the shared water resources, shared surface water resources in the Middle East. And studies suggest that 66% of fresh water resources in the Arab region originate from outside the national border. And 14 out of 22 Arab states sharing a surface water body. Examples, I can give you the example of Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Jordan River Basin, Senegal River Basin. So these are shared between countries. There are already signs out there that the issue of the water scarcity has started to manifest in creating competition between countries over the shared water resources. And that happens mainly, for example, through the building of dams. And that creates fears between countries on the shortages of the downstream flow. And there are already signs. There is the example of the tension between Ethiopian, Sudanese, and the Egyptian, which is stemming from the building of the Ethiopian resonance dam. And then also because the Tigris and the Euphrates, they are originating from Turkey and Iran. So Turkey and Iran are controlling the water flow to Syria and Iraq. And there are already negotiations out there because both Iran and Turkey are also building dams, and that is, reducing the downstream flow of water to the countries like Iraq and Syria. This is also to show that the water resources the shared water resources are not only the surface, but also in terms of the aquifers. They are also a large number of aquifers are shared, and this also, because there is a rise in the depletion of those aquifers, and because that is also impacted because of the impacts of the climate change, we could expect more and more tension if we don't address those issues in the right way. Again, also, it is good to bring live examples of what is happening. There are already examples that climate change has started to create internal and regional tensions. In the middle, I mentioned the tension over the Nile River between Ethiopian, Sudanese, and Egyptians. And also, for example, in Iran, last year in July, there have been protests out there in Kazakhstan, and that has been not only the first time, but it has happened in a frequent manner because of the shortages in water. Actually, what the people felt, not the shortages of water, but they have been exposed to electricity blackout. And actually, that electricity is produced through the hydropower. So there have been protests, and then, of course, one have been killed, as reported in this BBC article. I mentioned also that the Gulf region, Oman, has been experiencing frequency of extreme weather events. Also, this BBC article reports 13 people have been killed last year. I think the number represents both Oman and Iran. But also, we need to think also about the damage to the infrastructure and the compensation that needs to be taken into consideration. Here I just, this is just a summary of all points that I mentioned before in terms of the physical impacts, the impact on the water, agriculture, food security, also the energy access as well, the internal conflicts and the transboundary conflicts that could be created by the climate change. Now, let's move to the third element of today's talk. It's about, okay, these are the issues that the region is facing, how much the issues manage to tackle those climate challenges. So before I delve in, I also want for us to differentiate when the countries address climate change, they do it in two ways. So the COP that we are speaking about, it is a global conference where the countries go and negotiate, and they also communicate how they are going to tackle climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And for that, they also submit the nationally determined contributions. It's a report that is submitted to the UNFCCC. However, we need to also understand that is not enough. That is, those reports that are submitted to the UNFCCC is just a report. It doesn't necessarily mean that domestically that the country is doing something about it. And this is something we need to look at. So here I just wanted to show that the countries in the Middle East, in fact, have been active in terms of international governance of climate change, because all of them, except for Libya, Iran, and Yemen, all of them have ratified the Paris Agreement. And all of them have been communicated to the UNFCCC and submitting reports such as the National Communication Report, Biennial Update Reports, and the nationally determined contributions. What is important is to look at what the countries have been doing domestically in terms of setting the targets, in terms of putting forward strategies and policies and a governance structure to address climate change. So here, I wasn't able to put all countries in one table, in one slide, so I'm just selecting a few countries. Optimistically, the countries have been doing progress in terms of setting targets as well as putting forward strategies to address climate change. And that is, as we see here, there are renewable energy targets for example, in the Gulf Arab states and in Egypt. They also have, some of the countries in the region have set net zero target by or around mid-century. Not all of them have a climate strategy in place at the moment, but most of them do have initiatives that are related to addressing the climate change. both in terms of mitigation as well as adaptation. Also here, I want for us also to look if the countries, because there are regional issues, regional climate-related issues, and so the countries in the region also are well aware of those challenges, and there has been some regional governance structure out there to look at issues, for example, the shared water resources, and a most recent example is the Middle East Initiative. Middle East Initiative that have been established last year in 2021 by Saudi Arabia, and it has different targets, including scaling up the investments and the carbon capture and storage, cloud seeding programs, that is also for water, and also establishing regional center for sustainable development and fisheries. How effective those governance structures and how operational are they? That is a real question. So we are looking here at establishments since 1979. To answer this question, the study that I'm putting a picture of on the top, we've tried to look at how effective those structures are. If I can highlight on one of the findings, we found that those governance structure, there are some regulations out there, for example, for water and general environmental regulations. However, they remain unupdated. And in terms of the implementation, there are a lot of gaps there, especially we see an initiatives and then we don't see a follow-up for that initiatives. We also found that there is a transparency gap as well. But you can look at the paper if you are interested to know more. Yes, I mentioned that shared water resources or the water scarcity in the region is a big issue. And there are some inter-ministerial committees. One example, the one at the level of the Arab League, and then the other one is on the level of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the international organizations like the ESCWA actually has been more active in this area in terms of bringing regional countries to come together, negotiate, have dialogue, and discuss solutions on how to address the water scarcity issues. Again, the paper on the right is also a good overview for those institutions. Here, since we are saying that COP27 is the COP of the implementation, it's really important to look at what countries have done on the ground. So, for example, I just mentioned that there are some renewable energy targets out there, and if we look at this figure, globally, the renewable energy installed capacity has indeed increased over the years, and for the Middle East region, it has increased by 38% between 2011 and 2021. However, if we look at the primary energy consumption for each country in the region, we can see, I don't know if you see the green. So if you see the green, that is the renewable energy. But I don't think it is very clear here because the primary energy consumption is still dominated by the oil and gas, despite that progress in developing the renewable energy. So I think there is still a big gap to be filled there. And also, there aren't too many studies that evaluate how much the countries have progressed in terms of their climate action. But this report, I had the pleasure to participate in putting together with the Mohammed bin Rashid School. So this one is looking at how the Arab countries have been progressing in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this slide, I'm trying to just focus on Sustainable Development Goal number 7 and 13. Number 13 is on the climate action. The bad news is no one Arab region has yet achieved Sustainable Development Goal number 13 on the climate action. However, and that's, if you look at the colors, it's either in red, yellow, or orange. But it is only the blue that indicates that the SDG has been achieved. However, the arrows show that the countries are doing progress when it comes to the climate action. Right. In here, I just wanted for us to see on how the people in the region think about the climate change, how the people think that how serious is climate change. If we look at the figure on the left, that is a global picture. So since 2017, so the environmental issues are in green. So there has been progress. These have been coming, to the top. For example, the water crisis, the extreme weather events are coming to the picture as we move on. But if we look at the middle, the MENA region, and these are figures from 2019, it is not a most recent one. If we look at how the people think about the top risks that they are concerned about, you can see first one, energy price shock, unemployment, terrorist attack, and it is until number 8 that we see a climate-related issue, which is the water crisis. So there are more pressing concerns for the region that comes ahead of the climate change. There is recently the Arab Barometer also have published some statistics on how the people think about climate change. So that provides more of a recent data on how the people think about it. Now we go back to the main question, what to expect from COP27 and beyond. And here I want for us not to think about it only from a negotiation point of view, but also the consequences of it on the ground. So to just summarize on what we expect, actually, as I mentioned, there are issues with the rise in the temperature. There's the issue with the water, food security. So, and then also the extreme weather events. So it is not surprising that the focus of the negotiation in the upcoming COP will be on climate finance, climate adaptation, and loss and damage. In terms of the climate finance, the Arab countries, so there is the pledge, a global pledge that the developed countries should provide the developing countries with finance, which should equal to 100 billion in a yearly basis. But we are far away from achieving that goal. But if we look at the Arab region, how much the Arab region has achieved so far, it's only 6% of the international public finance flow. And there are studies that suggest that climate finance in the region, for the Arab region, should actually be between 436 billions to 478 billions by 2030. However, the region has only received 1 to 7.4 billion a year so far. So this would be for Egypt and for Africa, this would be one of the pressing issues that needs to be addressed out there. Adaptation also for the Arab region, when it comes to the adaptation, there's the need for human capacity building and the transfer of the know-how and the technology, along with the finance. Loss and damage, to what extent this issue is discussed within the region, well, it's going for sure to come in the negotiations, but I don't see it coming at the top of the discussion so far, especially in terms of the negotiations and the preparations for the COP. And also going beyond COP27 in COP28. And I think those issues, when the UAE is hosting COP28, I think the UAE, the focus would be more on the other, on the climate mitigation aspect rather than the adaptation, because there are some studies that shows that the Gulf states have more caution to adapt to the climate change compared to the others. But it is not also meant to say that the adaptation will not come at front in the negotiations. But as I mentioned, wherein the hydrocarbon resources of an importance to the economy of the Gulf Arab states, one major issue to be discussed there is the impact of the response measures. And this is this phrase is what exactly mean. It means that there are countries where economy will be negatively impacted as the global community advance climate policy. And for example, small island countries could be, impacted by the sea level rise. And for those countries, the impact of response measure, so these countries would require compensation for that impact. For hydrocarbon countries, actually, there has been a request for the compensation that comes out of the reduction on the revenues for the oil and gas export, but there hasn't been any progress out there. But I think this issue would be discussed further when the UAE hosts the COP. Another issue is the carbon markets. The carbon markets, to simplify it, it is a mechanism where the countries put a price on the carbon, and a mechanism where the countries trade the carbon credits so they can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is also could be a concern for the hydrocarbon producing countries. However, we have seen some, as this is coming to a front in the negotiations, we have seen some implications on it on the ground. Some countries have started to put a price on the carbon, but for the Gulf Arab states, there is a voluntary carbon market initiative. We have seen one established by the Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia, and then also another one in the UAE. One last point is the global stocktake, the first global stocktake, which is a mechanism to measure the progress of the countries in achieving their climate commitments. It will take, the first one of it will take place in 2023 in the UAE. So that would actually put a pressure of the countries in the region and globally to showcase how they are progressing in achieving their climate targets. Last slide for today. Why should the dynamics of climate in the MENA matter for Singapore? So for Singapore is one main concern for Singapore is the energy security. So Singapore is trying to diversify its energy or fuel imports as much as possible. And it is importing around 36% of its fuel is coming from the MENA region. At the same time, Singapore has the ambitions to also transition from depending on the carbon-intensive fuels like to cleaner fuel sources. Singapore has started with the natural gas, and they have the ambitions also to expand on using the renewable energy, the hydrogen. And Singapore has established the Green Plan, the 2030 Green Plan, where they aim basically to reduce their greenhouse gas emission footprint. And also so as the UAE is hosting the COP in 2023 next year, is it going to be an Asia COP? So is that going to translate in more of cooperation between the two regions, as the two regions also both has aspirations to develop cleaner energy sources? And also it's important to highlight that both regions, in fact, are facing common climate challenges, including the water security, the sea level rise, and the exposure to extreme weather events. And does that mean that the countries would come together to work closely on addressing those challenges? And I'm also including some pictures from Egypt and from Saudi, where we show the two sides, Singapore and the Arab stakeholders are actually already speaking about those issues. Sorry to take a very long time, but I close my presentation here, and thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for an extremely informative and comprehensive presentation. You underlined the problem about water. I do believe you deserve a sip of water after more than 1 hour of talk now. It's quite interesting, as you were mentioning in one of your slides, the matter of perception. You presented us with very important scientific data, but perception also plays an important role. And in the top 10 risks, you managed to put only at the 8th place water, and it was the only one climate related. It's quite interesting because I just landed in Singapore a couple of hours ago from Dubai. I was in Dubai during the last week, and the perception that you can have at street level is that tomorrow is going to be better than today. Economics is booming, real estate is booming, and all the talk that I had in these days in Dubai was about blockchain and cryptocurrency. Nobody mentioned water. But in your presentation, you highlighted 3 points, very, very important in my opinion. One, warming up is 2 times faster in the Middle East than in the other area. 2, we are not talking about water scarcity. We are talking about absolute water scarcity. And then a very gloomy 3% GDP decline in the coming years. And you mentioned a 2-case scenario, the worst case scenario, but also I was looking at the, let's say, the good one. It doesn't look good at all. So having said that, are we in denial, or we are overconfident on the COP27 implementation? And this is something that I do believe need to be discussed. But now, talking about flood, we have a flood of questions from our audience online. So if the audience here apologize me, the one present here in the room, I start with online, and then we can give the floor to the question here. And the question mainly that I receive now are about water. One is from Baochuan Elizabeth. One of the contributing factors to water scarcity is increasing salinity, which is made worse by more dam construction. How significant do you think this will affect food security, especially looking at agriculture? And there is a follow-up saying, how significant do you think that food security, especially also not only agriculture, but in fishery, is going to be affected? I think we can start with this one.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for very important questions indeed. And so if I go back to the first question in terms of the perception, so also I want to say that there isn't enough surveys out there that measure the people perception about the climate change. There are a few out there. I mentioned the Arab Barometer. And for that reason also, I have been most recently involved in a regional study. We have conducted a survey, a perception survey, to measure the people awareness and understanding of the impact of the climate change around the Red Sea region. And we covered almost 11 countries around the Red Sea. We are now still working on the results. But if I can go back to your question, the water scarcity is there. The region is warming, and the GDP is expected to decline. But the people don't talk about it on the daily basis. Well, that's true, because if we look at the water scarcity issue, as I mentioned also in one slide, 90% of the people actually they do have access to water at the moment. So they are not really aware that there is an issue because they have access to the water. So they are not aware that the desalination perhaps is playing a role. So I think the awareness factor is really playing a role in there. And also like to understand the people awareness, the integration of the climate studies and the science in the education curricula, it's not been integrated there for a long time. So also if you go and speak to a student from the region, like what do you know about the climate change? They might don't understand the phrase of the climate change. So I think it is really a matter of awareness. The problem is there, but also the people don't talk about it or not consider it as a serious or priority issue. But that said, I think at the level of the policymakers, I think the awareness is there. There are, and especially as Egypt is hosting COP27 and the UAE is next year hosting COP28, there are a lot of meetings going on in the region out there, either to prepare for the COP or also the international organizations get involved also on discussing the issues, especially the ESCWA is really playing a major role. ESCWA is, the models that I've shown is from a study that has been conducted by the ESCWA, because most of the studies that speak about the climate change, they look at it from a global perspective, and the RICA report that I've presented is actually prepared for the Middle East and specifically on the Middle East by ESCWA. So I think awareness, I think also the education, and then I think also the amount of studies and the connection between science and the policy. These are the main factors why we don't speak about it as serious as it is. The second point is a really good point, and I didn't talk about the issue of the salinity. That is indeed an issue. So it is not only there's the depletion of the water resources and then the rise in the temperature and the evaporation of it, But with that also, and this is really happening, being from the region, I have seen how agricultural areas have been affected by that. So what happens? So if we have an aquifer here and then we have the sea here, as we deplete the water from the aquifer, actually that gives an opportunity for the seawater to come, and it is called the seawater intrusion, and that actually leads to salinating the water. So the governments in the region, in a way, they try to find solution for it. One of it is to do desalination for the seawater, and one of it is also to desalinate the groundwater as well. And actually, like if we have the sea and the aquifer here, and here we have agricultural land, I have seen it with my eye. It's actually from the village that I came from. So the agricultural land transfer into something like a burned agricultural land. So yes, for the countries that depends on the agriculture as a source of economy, this is a serious issue. And also for the Middle East countries, almost 80% of the food is imported from outside. So this is also a serious issue that needs to be tackled.
Thank you very much. Talking about food shortage helped me to rope in the other question. There are a set of questions, and for a matter of time, I will compact them together. And basically, it's talking about the elephant in the room, Russia invasion of Ukraine. In several areas of the Middle East, most of the MENA region, it created a shortage of food staple, just you mentioned it now. In other areas, created an unexpected wealth, especially in the GCC, in terms of oil. But if we look in a broader dynamic, looking already that we are in a post-COVID recovery mode, then there is this additional problem created by the negative spillover of the war in Ukraine. How these two very complex dynamics are affecting climate policy and energy transition in the region.
This is a very complicated and a really good question as well. So the Russia-Ukraine crisis, it came almost right after the countries are trying to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So for the countries in the Middle East, as I mentioned in the presentation, we do have the wealthiest and we have the poorest. So in a simple terms, the implications of the Russia-Ukraine crisis to the Middle East countries, it made the rich richer and the poor poorest. So if we look, for example, at Jordan, countries like Jordan, Yemen, the inflation has increased in there. And so the food prices has increased. The electricity bill has increased, also the price of the fuel. And that also, in fact, the crisis has, in fact, sent mixed signals to the Middle East when it comes to the clean energy transition. In a way, although it has been difficult for countries like Jordan, say Yemen, for example, to feel the implications of the crisis, but in a way, it has forced those countries or the households to find, something more stable, something more cheaper, which is the installation of the solar panels in their rooftop. However, also there is the challenge of the disruption of the supply chain because of the war, and also because of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So they are in a difficult position. Either pay the high price of the energy or find the alternative, which is renewables. It is cheaper given the current situation. However, as I mentioned, the supply chain is an issue. On the other hand, For hydrocarbon-rich countries, say the Gulf countries, the other countries in North Africa, like Algeria, Libya, the crisis in a way has created an opportunity for those countries to both tap on their hydrocarbon reserves. We have seen different visits from Western leaders, including the President Biden visit to Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region. This week, there was a visit from the German, to the region, where he also signed a natural gas agreement with the UAE. What I'm trying to say, it's the crisis, although the European countries, they are in a difficult position to find alternative supplies of the energy and meet the immediate needs of the energy. And also they are in a position also to meet their climate targets. There's the European Green Deal. And each country also, because of the crisis, have put or advanced their renewable energy targets. So they are in a position to face the current crisis as well as meet their long-term climate targets. And that, in a way, is sending a mixed signal to other countries, like the hydrocarbon-rich countries, like in the Gulf. So through those visits, the priority is to sign agreements in the oil or on natural gas supply. However, I am optimistic because also the discussion of, advancing cooperation on clean and energy fuels like hydrogen has been actually mentioned. And if we look at the meetings that happens, actually the European delegation, when they visited Egypt to sign a natural gas agreement, it has been done between the representative of the European Commission, who is responsible for the European Green Deal, and also from the Egypt side is the presidents of the COP27. So that is in a way gives hope that clean energy transition is not left aside, at least maybe not in the short term, because developing these resources is going to take time, but at least for the mid and long term.
I'm extremely glad that they're optimistic because you are the expert on the matter. I'm very pessimistic on this in terms of climate action and the Green Deal, especially from an European point of view. Now that there is, again, perception that there's going to be a cold winter, winter is coming, war is still going to be there for at least some time ahead. And then this preoccupation of the climate deal is no more something that matters on the present in Europe, or at least it seems from my perspective, but luckily you are optimistic on that. And with the next question, I'm trying to fuse security and water as we are discussing now. And the question from Zoom is, no need to say that water, has been written a lot about water, and it's already there. And it's not just in the Middle East, but even in Asia, there are potential flashpoints between states. The statistics given seem to indicate that it is an increasing rare resource. How do you see countries working toward managing this issue? Are there efforts to think about how technology could help them manage such a valuable resource? There is an example, for example, come to my mind that now the UAE is using cloud seeding, but still is a technology that is quite untested. China is bent on the same page. So what's your comment on this question?
Okay, so, so the water scarcity has been an issue that the policy makers have been aware of, and in terms of finding the solutions of it, so far those solutions has been translated in developing more of supply sources of it, as, for example, the desalination technology. However, the issue in the region is about also managing the demand side of water. Although there is an issue of water scarcity, the per capita consumption of the water is one of the highest in the region, is one of the highest in the world. So there is a challenge also to look how to manage the demand side of it, how to change the behavior of the people. And here also comes the point about the perception. People don't think like we do have a water issue, and that is really critical in terms of changing the behavior of the people to, you know, reduce their water consumption. That said, also another point that I want to bring is that the water desalination technology is mostly imported in the region. There is no the development of national capacity so far as you know. However, this issue has been discussed on and on within the region since the 70s. And we most recently have started to see some progress, not in practical terms, but at least in terms of having the dialogue. For example, there was a conference hosted in the last few weeks in Saudi Arabia, and it discussed the desalination technology. And one of the elements that have been discussed is how to localize this technology. And different experts have been brought there to exchange the knowledge and the know-how, and also to bring countries to come and work together. Also, in terms of the cooperation between countries, yes, there are some institutional governance architecture, both at the regional level. At the level of the MENA region, there is a ministerial committee that looks at the water issues in the MENA region under the Arab League. And then there is also another ministerial committee at the Gulf Cooperation Council, and that one has issued a strategy for water resource management across the GCC countries. To standardize how the water will be managed across the countries. But again, there is a question, okay, we do have a strategy, but do we implement that strategy, and does it work? We still don't have an answer for it, but there are some studies have been published about this strategy. And also, water scarcity is a global issue as well. From my knowledge, there's also the US is leading a global dialogue on to enable the transfer of the know-how between countries, and also they are in preparation to bring those dialogues also to the COP27. One entity from the Middle East that have been involved in those negotiation dialogues is the MEDREC. It is a water management and desalination research center based in Muscat in Oman. And this one has been established between Oman and Israel, actually. And one idea behind it is, to enable the capacity building around water management. There are delivering some master programs, so they bring the students to come and study about the water issues. They provide scholarships for also students from the region to go and focus on the management of the water resources. So there are some initiatives out there. But I think the gap between having an initiative and implementing them and having implications on the ground, I think that gap is still a huge gap.
Oh, there's a very interesting news about Oman because at the time of Sultan Qaboos, Oman was a leading regional actor in geopolitical international relations diplomacy, and now having Oman, let's call it as a water diplomacy actor, is going to be very important for the region because it's an actor that knows how to do it. One suggestion for our audience here in person, you are not on mute, so feel free to raise your hand and we will deliver a microphone to you. For the moment, just allow me to read another question from Zoom, from Nawaz Muhammad. Did I hear that the Middle East countries don't have a long-term low-emission development strategy? For example, Singapore have one. If so, do you think there will be such an initiative or a motivation in the near future?
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Mohammed, for the question and for attending the presentation. There are some targets out there. There are renewable energy targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy targets to scale up the development of renewables. And also some countries in their nationally determined contribution have set carbon emission reduction target. For example, Saudi Arabia have done so. Oman have put a target to reduce the emissions by 7%. In terms of the strategies, the UAE does have a national climate strategy, which focus both on the adaptation and the mitigation. And also in terms of the low emissions, also we didn't expect that countries in the regions will commit to net zero targets. So far, 3 countries have announced commitments to net zero targets, including Bahrain, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And Oman, actually, there are some talks that Oman also will announce a net zero target soon. So there are some targets out there. There are strategies. Again, my concern also is the gap between having a strategy and having a target, but also doing or implementing the right policies and the regulations that helps to achieve those targets.
And before also you mentioned in the perception the role of subsidies. If you don't pay the real cost of water, you don't have a perception that water is a scarce resource. Something that no matter what we are going to see sooner or later in the GCC is that this subsidy, not only on water but on fuel or electricity, are going to be less and less, or shrink it down even on food. So in your opinion, this climate change ongoing and creating bigger problem, compounded with subsidy, is going to create fragmentation in the relationship between state and society?
Okay, thanks for an excellent question, which is not discussed much, actually. So yes, so the countries in the region are classified as I mentioned, the per capita consumption of water is one of the highest, and also the energy consumption on per capita basis is one of the highest. Also, with that comes also the carbon emissions on per capita basis is also one of the highest, and indeed the subsidized of the provisions of the water and the electricity have been a main reason behind that. And speaking about behavior, and as I mentioned, there is an issue of the demand side management. Indeed, the subsidies have been playing a role there. And actually, if we don't, and even for renewables, if the people find renewable is more expensive than the conventional resources, there will be no incentive to go and invest in renewables. As far as we have access to cheaper hydrocarbon resources. However, I think what would help on addressing those issues is not perhaps in the short term the environment and the climate concerns, and here come the perception that we have today. It will be the economic challenges. And in fact, the COVID-19 crisis has actually put the subsidies at front. So because there was a pressure on the state budgets because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that put the governments to look at the subsidies. And they looked at how they can, the reform of the subsidies could actually reduce the pressure on the budget. And in fact, it happened. It happened there was energy price reforms in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and in the UAE. It happened actually also earlier than COVID-19. It happened, for example, because of the drop in the oil prices in 2014. That put pressure over the governments to consider economic reforms within the country. But from a climate perspective, again, as the countries are setting carbon reduction targets, there will be more and more of need to reform the subsidies and reduce the incentives in the energy sector, so they can reduce the consumption of the energy and as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, that's challenging from a political point of view, where the state-society relations, in a way, have been for a long time built around those subsidies. And with the countries are setting carbon net zero targets, that also could translate for those countries to consider putting a price on the carbon. So they can, in that way, they can, put a pressure over the people to reduce their consumption of, for example, electricity or the water. However, that would be challenging moving forward. But as I mentioned, the 2014 drop in the oil prices, as well as COVID-19, the impacts of COVID-19, have been a reminder that maybe environmental or climate issue, but it is a real economic concern, even for the wealthiest countries in the region.
Thank you again. I think we have a question from the floor. Please.
Thank you so much, Alex. The climate change and the activities surrounding it is really fascinating to study. I see at the 3 level, the world is trying to mitigate it. At the diplomatic level, the COP series that Aisha has just elaborately mentioned. At the scientific level, the energy transition is happening all of the country, and the scientific people are working. There's a third aspect, and that is the financial sector, where carbon trading is happening. And that brings us to the role of Singapore as the world's leading financial and trading hub, and its ambition to become a world's leading carbon services and trading hub. So I would like to ask Aisha this question: how do you see the potential of Singapore becoming a world's leading carbon services and trading hub? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Asif, for a very excellent question. So I have been following the progress of Singapore on their ambitions to be a climate action leader at the global level. And they are really progressing really fast. In terms of the carbon trading, here at the level of the NUS, the NUS has programs for stakeholders to get and involved. It is designed by the NUS Business School to help them go and understand what the carbon trade market is and how does it work and how to be involved in it. And Singapore also have been a leader in being for making an announcement to make it part of it is a sovereign wealth fund. I think, however, there is when it comes to carbon trading, it is a relatively new concept, and there needs to be more of developing and of an understanding of it. And then with it also, there is a need also to enhance the cooperation between countries to get involved. And one of the challenges with the carbon trading is to put a price on carbon and to standardize that price. Today, different regions have different price on the carbon. So, for example, Europe has a different price on carbon. Countries here in Asia and this part, they have different price on carbon. And that makes it difficult for the countries to trade in, or the regions to trade in between each other. That said, also that would have probably implications for the Middle East countries because, as I mentioned, Middle East countries have announced voluntary carbon markets so far. They are not operational at the moment. The Saudi one is promised to start operationalizing in 2023. But you know, with further and further cooperation between countries, we could see more of a progress in that area.
Thank you very much. And you talk about cooperation between countries, and I can see we still have several questions, but time is running out, so I will just allow one more question from our Zoom audience. And this question basically asks you to gaze at the crystal ball and look at the future. COP27, COP28. Will the regional host of upcoming COP enhance cooperation or competition between regional countries?
Very excellent and a very difficult question at the same time. I like to be optimistic. Why? Because as I mentioned, the negotiations around the climate change is not that old. Yes, the UNFCCC have been established 30 years ago. However, all of the time that has been spent in the negotiation is for the countries to understand how they are impacted by the climate change, how they can address the climate change. And now we've spent almost 30 years just to discuss that. The implementation aspect is happening only now. So I do like to be optimistic whenever we see a small progress happening out there. Whether there will be cooperation or competition, so far, and especially that Egypt is hosting COP27 and the UAE is hosting COP28, so far at least at the level of preparing for the COPs, we have seen more of the countries coming together. For example, Egypt and the UAE come together and discuss what issues they want to bring at the COP, how do they want to prepare for the COP. There are some also events that are taking place within the region in preparation for the COP. An example is the Middle East Climate Week that took place in Dubai this year, where it brought together the stakeholders from within the region, the Middle East, and also from other parts of the world. They came in Dubai, and then they sat together and discussed different aspects of the climate issue in terms of the mitigation, adaptation, the finance, and all of that. However, also, to be realistic also, we need to look at it, does it happen from practical point of view to solve the issue from practical way? There are some signs that shows the cooperation is happening. And for that, I can bring the example of the cooperation between Jordan, Israel, and the UAE. Most recently, they signed an agreement where they can exchange water for electricity production from renewable energy resources. So I think it's Jordan who produced the renewable energy, and in exchange for that, they get water from Israel. And the UAE has been involved in that agreement. There's also the agreements between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, where Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt, where they want to develop a national grid so they can exchange electricity. As well, there's the attempt to include the renewables with that exchange. However, from a historical point of view, when we look at the developments that comes to the climate change, from a historical, we have seen kind of a competition between countries. At least we see that one country would set, for example, a renewable energy target or a net zero target. And then the next day, without any obvious cooperation with the neighbor, we see the neighbor is also announcing that. And from a present example, there's a growing momentum also to develop the hydrogen in the region. So, so far, and I have written about this most recently, the countries are working, at least in the Gulf Arab states, they are working on developing national strategies and regulations to enable the hydrogen development, but we didn't see signs of cooperations between those countries. Each country is working on its own. So there could be, with that, we could see a future where countries, compete with each other because they want also to have, each country would want to have a large share in the market when it comes to the hydrogen. So, however, the host of the COP27 and 28, and probably to conclude with an optimistic, point, I think that would hopefully bring the countries closer together and cooperate more and more in the area.
Aisha, thank you very much again for this very informative session, and I have to thank you twice for the optimistic tone. That is something that we really need. Please allow me to ask to our audience for a round of applause, and thank you again for today's event.
Thank you very much.